Grace jolted awake, the sudden emptiness beside her sending a cold shiver through her. She reached out instinctively for Ethan, but the sheets were chilled, untouched. The silence of the room suffocated her as her heartbeat quickened. Where is he? Her breath caught in her throat as she sat up. The dim light of the clock read 2:15 a.m. She frowned, pulling the covers back as a strange sensation crept over her, a feeling she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. Grace sat still, listening. At first it was just the silence of the house, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood settling. But then, faint voices, muffled whispers. Her pulse quickened. She strained to hear more. What's going on? The whispers turned into faint footsteps, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Her stomach lurched, anxiety gnawing at her insides. Where is he going at this hour? The sight of Ethan slipping out of the house sent Grace into action. She grabbed her coat, barely feeling the cold as she shoved her arms through the sleeves. Her hands were shaky as she grabbed her keys. Every instinct in her screamed to ignore it, to trust him. But the nagging doubt inside her pushed her out the door. Grace slid into her car, breath shallow, heart racing. She kept a careful distance, watching Ethan's car as he drove away. The dark night swallowed him up, but she couldn't stop herself from following. What's going on, Ethan? She could barely hear the thoughts in her head over the sound of her own anxious breath. Grace's mind was consumed with questions as she trailed Ethan at a cautious distance. His car glided through the streets, oblivious to her presence. Has he been lying to me this whole time? The thought kept circling back, and the more she thought about it, the more the doubt festered. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. All those late nights, those strange excuses. What am I missing? Her chest tightened. She thought she knew Ethan, trusted him, loved him, but now, what if I'm wrong? The car felt too quiet, too still. As they passed a familiar landmark, the questions gnawed at her until they were louder than her heartbeat. Ethan's car turned down an unfamiliar road, the headlights illuminating a dark parking lot, before disappearing behind a tall building. Grace's pulse spiked as she hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tighter. She parked a few blocks away, her fingers trembling as she kept her eyes fixed on the building. What is he doing here? Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the building, the possibility of a secret she never imagined hanging in the air. She felt the weight of the night pressing down on her as her breath caught. What if this is something I can't come back from? Time stretched endlessly as Grace sat, watching. The minutes passed in silence, her thoughts a blur of accusations and fears. She replayed every moment of their life together, the warmth of their shared dinners, the quiet moments in bed, the subtle distance he'd pulled away from her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Megan. Grace stared at the message but didn't reply. How could she explain any of this? How could she explain what was happening when she herself wasn't sure? The doubt settled like a weight on her chest. What am I doing? She wasn't sure anymore. The certainty she'd once felt about her marriage was crumbling with every passing second. Grace stiffened as the door to the building creaked open. Ethan emerged. His eyes darted around, glancing over his shoulder, his body language agitated. He didn't look like himself. Pale, tense, moving quickly. Grace's breath hitched as he slipped into his car, the engine roaring to life as he sped off. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Did he see me? Did he know I was here? She leaned back in her seat, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Was this what I think it was? His furtive movements told her everything she needed to know. Grace followed Ethan's car as they made their way back home. Each mile felt heavier than the last, the questions swelling inside her like an uncontrollable storm. What was he doing in there? Why didn't he tell me? Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. She thought about the secrets he was hiding, the truth that had been right in front of her all along, but she couldn't bear to face it. The silence between them was deafening, and the thought of confronting him made her stomach churn. She had no answers, no clear path forward. But the truth, no matter how painful, was closing in on her, and soon she would have no choice but to confront it. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug, eyes scanning the family photos on the wall. The house, spacious, tidy, warm, was everything she had dreamed of when she married Ethan. His smile, always so confident, so reassuring, looked back at her from the picture frames, his arm draped around her shoulders, their son Lucas nestled between them. The picture-perfect life. She sighed softly, her eyes lingering on Ethan's grin in the most recent photo. We have it all, she thought, but even as the words formed in her mind, a flicker of doubt passed through her. Don't we? The sound of Lucas's laughter from the other room momentarily pulled Grace from her thoughts. She smiled at the familiar sound, but quickly felt the weight of her own reality press down on her chest. She had chosen this life, hadn't she? Left her career as an event planner behind to raise their son, to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. But somewhere along the way, the sense of fulfillment had begun to slip through her fingers. Was it enough? Ethan's career thrived. He was always busy, always working late. And she? She spent her days in the small, insulated world of their home, where Lucas was her only company, and even his chatter couldn't fill the void that was growing in her heart. She missed the excitement, the recognition, the sense that she mattered beyond the walls of the house. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes catching the reflection of herself in the kitchen window. Who am I now? The woman she used to be, the one with fire and ambition, seemed so distant. Grace smiled at the memory of their early days together. She had been swept off her feet by Ethan's charm, his quick wit, and his relentless pursuit of her. Those late-night talks, the passionate kisses, the promises he made, "I'll never hurt you, Grace, you're the one." His words had been so convincing, so full of love and certainty. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the warmth of his touch when they were first together. What happened? That passionate connection felt so distant now. It was as if they were two strangers sharing the same space. Grace knew something was wrong. Ethan, once so attentive, now barely noticed her. His long hours at work had become more frequent, his texts shorter, his eyes distant when he did look at her. The energy between them had shifted. She could feel it in the air, thick and unspoken. There were nights when he would lie beside her, his back turned, not even reaching for her hand. Her mind raced. Maybe it's just stress, she tried to convince herself. Maybe it's just the pressures of work, the demands of raising a family. But deep down, she felt a coldness creeping in. The emotional distance between them had become a chasm. Every time he came home late or buried himself in his phone, it felt like he was slipping further away. Was this the beginning of the end? The small things kept piling up, the quiet changes that tugged at Grace's gut. Ethan was more protective of his phone than usual, hiding it when she came near, his fingers quickly swiping it away as though he didn't want her to see. She watched as he took unexplained calls in another room, his tone curt, the words just out of earshot, always whispering when he spoke. She tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself it was nothing. But the unease gnawed at her. Why is he so secretive all of a sudden? Grace's mind raced as the questions multiplied, feeding the growing sense of dread inside her. Could it be? Could he be hiding something from me? It was a careless mistake. Ethan had left his second phone in the glove compartment of his car. When Grace found it, she felt a strange mixture of curiosity and dread. Her fingers hovered over it for a moment before she opened it, the screen lighting up. The phone was locked, but the notifications were visible. Texts, calls, emails, all from unknown numbers. Her stomach twisted as she read the brief message from one contact. "You still on for tonight?" Grace's heart pounded. What was this? Why? Didn't Ethan tell her about this phone? Who was he keeping in touch with, and why the secrecy? The questions swirled in her mind like a storm, each one more unsettling than the last. She couldn't keep it to herself anymore. The weight of the secrets was suffocating. Grace met Megan for coffee, her nerves frayed, her thoughts scattered. She poured out everything: Ethan's behavior, the second phone, the unexplained calls. Megan listened quietly, her face serious. "Grace," Megan finally said, her voice firm but kind. "You know your gut. Don't ignore it. He's hiding something. You need to find out what it is, or you'll regret it." Grace stared at her friend, the truth sinking in. She had been afraid of what she might discover, but the fear of living in the unknown was worse. Megan's words burned into her mind. "Trust your instincts." It started innocently enough, just a passing mention here and there. "Ava, my new assistant," Ethan would say with a smile, talking about how efficient she was, how well she was doing at work. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time Ethan said her name, it seemed to linger in the air, as if he was saying it more than necessary. She didn't know who Ava was, but the name began to haunt her. Why does he talk about her so much? His eyes softened when he spoke of her, a warmth in his voice she hadn't heard directed at Grace in months. And the worst part? Grace couldn't stop imagining Ava's face, wondering what she looked like, how she fit into Ethan's life. Could she be more than just an assistant? Grace walked into their bedroom, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. As she tidied up the dresser, her eyes fell on a crumpled receipt on the floor. She bent down to pick it up, and her breath caught in her throat. The date was recent. The item? A diamond bracelet. Her pulse quickened as she read through the details. Ethan hadn't bought me anything recently, she thought, feeling the sting of betrayal before she even knew the full story. Another receipt, this time from a luxury restaurant she'd never visited, a dinner for two, on a night when Ethan had told her he was working late. Her hands trembled as she set the papers down. What was he doing? Grace couldn't shake the unsettling feeling gnawing at her insides. She kept replaying the receipts in her mind, the expensive dinner, the lavish jewelry. Who was he spending all this money on? The questions consumed her. Her thoughts spiraled in a desperate cycle. Could it be someone else? Was he seeing someone behind her back? Why would he hide this from me? The fear of betrayal twisted like a vice around her chest. Grace felt the weight of it pressing in, suffocating her. She knew she couldn't let it go. Not anymore. Grace's anxiety reached a breaking point, and she knew she needed answers, real answers. She picked up the phone and dialed the number she'd found online for a private investigator, Colin, known for his discreet work in exposing infidelity. The phone rang twice before the voice of a man with a gravelly tone answered. "Colin Anderson. This is Grace. I need your help." Her voice quivered slightly as she spoke. "I'm listening," Colin replied, his tone calm, measured. She explained everything, the strange behavior, the receipts, the nagging feeling she couldn't shake. Colin listened intently before offering his services. "I'll need to track him. Get you the proof you're looking for," he said simply. "I'll be in touch soon." The first report came a week later, and Grace couldn't bring herself to open it right away. When she did, the weight of the findings hit her like a punch to the gut. Colin's notes were precise. Ethan had been meeting someone named Ava, often, at strange hours in secluded locations far from the office. Grace reread the report, her heart sinking with every detail. It wasn't just a late-night meeting once. There was a pattern. Ava, that name that had haunted her thoughts for months, kept coming up. Ethan wasn't just spending time with her, he was meeting her, and they were spending time together in places he never took her. The truth was out there, and it was worse than she could have ever imagined. Grace couldn't hold it in any longer. She had to confront him. Ethan sat on the couch, flipping through his phone. She stood before him, the evidence in hand, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and hurt. "Ethan, what's going on?" she demanded, her hands clutching the papers tightly. Who is Ava? His eyes flickered briefly to the documents before looking away. Ava? Grace, you're being paranoid. She's just my assistant. You're reading too much into this. Why are you so upset? Grace's pulse spiked. Just his assistant? He'd been lying, weaving a web of deception so convincing she almost believed it. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of guilt perhaps, that made her press on. I found receipts for gifts, expensive ones, dinners that I didn't get. And then there's this. She held up the investigator's report. Late-night meetings, secluded spots. Tell me, Ethan, what's going on? He shook his head, frustration in his eyes. Grace, you're overreacting. You don't trust me anymore? I'm trying to work hard for us, for this family. The gaslighting was in full swing. Every word from his mouth twisted the reality she saw. Am I crazy? She wondered, her mind trying to make sense of his words. Grace wasn't ready to let go of the truth. She demanded that Colin keep digging, and the results only deepened the pit in her stomach. More photos, more reports. Ethan and Ava were meeting at different times, lunches, evening walks, hotel rendezvous. The timeline was damning. The secrecy was undeniable. Grace looked at the photos, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Ethan's hand resting casually on Ava's lower back, a look of warmth she hadn't seen in years. Her eyes blurred with tears. This was real. This wasn't some mistake. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. The confrontation with Ethan had done nothing. To ease her mind, if anything, it had made things worse. He continued to deny, to deflect, to gaslight. He kept saying everything was fine, that she was imagining things. But Grace couldn't ignore the growing pain inside her anymore. She couldn't ignore how Ava's name kept echoing in her head. And she couldn't ignore the distance between her and Ethan. He wasn't the man she married. He had become someone else entirely. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Was there any way out of this? How had she gotten here? It wasn't just an affair. Colin uncovered a shocking twist that shattered everything Grace had thought she knew about Ethan. Ava wasn't just a woman he was cheating with. She was using him. She had preyed on his insecurities, his fears about aging, about success. She had manipulated him, drawing him in with promises of affection, using his vulnerabilities to control him. Ava had a plan, and Grace realized too late that she wasn't just an intruder in her marriage. She was a calculated predator. She had been extracting financial and emotional resources from Ethan, knowing exactly how to play on his weaknesses. It only got worse. Colin's investigation revealed that Ava wasn't done yet. She was blackmailing Ethan, threatening to expose their affair to the world and destroy his career if he didn't meet her demands. Grace's stomach turned as she read the details. Ava's manipulations weren't just emotional, they were financial. She was demanding money, leverage, and control over Ethan's life, and he had been too desperate to stop it. Grace couldn't help but feel a sick sense of betrayal. Ethan had fallen for it. He had let Ava destroy them. Armed with the undeniable evidence of Ava's manipulations, Grace knew she couldn't wait any longer. She would confront Ethan, but this time, it wouldn't be about his excuses or his lies. This time, it would be about the truth he could no longer hide. Her heart raced as she prepared. She had nothing left to lose. No more illusions. No more hoping things would get better. She picked up her phone, took a deep breath, and dialed Ethan's number. This ends tonight. Grace couldn't wait any longer. The pieces were all there. Ava's manipulations, Ethan's lies, the receipts, the phone calls. And she was tired of pretending she didn't know what was going on. She needed to see it for herself. Late that night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Grace made the decision. She followed Ethan. The tension in the pit of her stomach grew with every turn she made. She knew the way. The high-end apartment building was unfamiliar, a place she'd never even seen on their family outings. Ethan had never mentioned it before. What if I'm wrong? Grace asked herself, but the thought of walking away now seemed impossible. She parked across the street, heart racing, watching the glow of the building lights, the reflection of cars passing by. Every instinct told her to leave, to pretend she never saw anything, but the anger pushed her forward. No more lies. She sat in her car for what felt like hours, staring at the apartment entrance, barely noticing the fog creeping in from the night air. Then, she heard it. Loud voices, sharp with frustration, echoed from inside the building. Grace's breath caught in her throat. That's them. She stood frozen, not daring to move as the voices grew more heated. Her heart pounded in her chest. What was happening in there? What were they saying? She pressed her back to the cold car door, steadying herself. A mix of dread and resolve washed over her. The fear of what she might find, of what Ethan might be saying, fueled her decision. She had to know. There was no going back now. The door to the apartment stood in front of her, like an ominous barrier. Grace banged her fist against it. The sound cut through the apartment, making both Ethan and Ava freeze inside. She didn't wait for a response. She turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room fell silent. Ethan stood there, face flushed with panic, his shirt untucked, his hair messy as if he'd just been in a whirlwind. Ava was seated on the couch, her posture relaxed, but her eyes, cold, knowing, met Grace's with a look that sent a chill down her spine. Ava's lips curled into a sly, almost dismissive smile. "Grace," Ethan stammered, but his voice lacked the confidence she once admired. "What are you doing here?" Grace's eyes locked onto his, the anger and betrayal surging to the surface, unstoppable. "What the hell is going on, Ethan?" she shouted. Her voice was trembling, but the fury behind it was clear. Ava stood up slowly, not an ounce of remorse in her expression. "This is it, Grace. The truth you've been avoiding." She stepped toward her, her words sharp like a knife. "Your husband is mine now." Ava's words hit like a slap. Grace's pulse hammered in her ears, her thoughts racing to catch up. She felt as if the world around her had crumbled into pieces and there was no safe space to stand. Ethan, standing beside Ava, finally broke. He opened his mouth, the words spilling out like a flood he couldn't stop. "Grace, He choked on his words, unable to finish. Ava raised an eyebrow, her eyes glinting with cold satisfaction. "He's been giving me everything. Money, gifts, attention. More than you ever did." Her voice was a venomous whisper. He couldn't resist. The power I held over him. I knew what he needed. What you couldn't give him anymore. Grace couldn't breathe. The betrayal burned through her veins like ice. She glanced at Ethan. "You've been seeing her behind my back? And all this time you were feeding her? You've been draining our savings for her? How much longer were you going to keep lying to me?" Her voice cracked as the weight of everything came crashing down on her. Ava didn't flinch. "Oh, it's not just about money, sweetheart," she said, looking Grace dead in the eyes. "Ethan's been making promises he can't keep, and if he doesn't keep his word, I'll destroy him. I'll expose him to everyone, to his clients, his friends, his family." She took a step closer to Grace, her voice turning dark. "I'll make sure your perfect little life is nothing but rubble." The truth shattered Ethan. His face paled, his body sagged under the weight of his own deceit. He collapsed onto the couch, his hand gripping the armrest as if it might save him from the chaos he had caused. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Grace, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought if I could just make her happy that maybe it would fix everything. I didn't think she would control me like this, but she does. She's got everything, my money, my secrets. And now she has me." Ethan's voice cracked, his words barely a whisper as he let the confession spill out. "I've been draining our savings, Grace. I couldn't stop it. She has me trapped." His face twisted with shame and regret. "I love you, but I couldn't fight it anymore." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. She wanted to scream, to lash out. But instead she stood still, her body paralyzed by the emotional devastation of it all. Ethan's double life, his lies, and the destruction of their marriage were too much to bear. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of betrayal. Grace's body trembled as she processed everything. The man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, had been a stranger in their marriage all along. Everything they had, everything she had believed in, was a lie. Ava stood by, watching, her expression one of satisfaction. Grace's heart pounded as she turned to face her, the woman who had masterminded this entire mess. "You did this. You used him. You manipulated him." Grace's voice was low, but there was a fire behind it. "And you've destroyed everything in the process." Ava smirked. "I didn't destroy anything, Grace. He did that all by himself. He chose me over you, and now he'll pay the price. He's mine, and there's nothing you can do to change that." Grace felt a rush of cold fury mixed with a deep sorrow. She wanted to break down, to cry, but something inside of her hardened. This was her moment of reckoning. The man she had shared everything with had shattered her world, and now she was left to pick up the pieces. She turned to Ethan, his face pale and defeated, and whispered, "I don't know who you are anymore." The betrayal had cut deeper than any physical wound could. But now Grace knew one thing for sure. The lies, the manipulation, and the secrets were over. Her life with Ethan was done. It was time for her to walk away, and she did. Grace sat on the edge of their bed, the soft hum of the late evening filling the silence around her. Ethan's belongings were scattered in disarray around her, as though they had no more meaning than dust. His absence was a hollow echo, a reminder of the life they had once shared. Before the betrayal, before Ava, before everything came crashing down. Tears welled in her eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. What about Lucas? She could feel her son's presence in the quiet house, in the toys still littering the living room, in the way he'd been clinging to her since the confrontation. She couldn't destroy his life. She had to protect him, even if it meant breaking her own heart. She stood up, feeling the finality of the decision hit her. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to the empty room. The rumors started small, whispers in the hallway, a comment at the office water cooler, but quickly spiraled out of control. Ethan's world began to unravel in ways he could no longer hide. He lost clients. Business partners pulled back. Even the people he thought were his closest friends started turning their backs on him. The betrayal had poisoned everything: his career, his reputation, and his very identity. He walked into the office on a Monday morning, only to be met with cold, judgmental stares. The walls seemed to close in as his coworkers avoided eye contact. Where was the respect he'd once commanded? In the conference room, his boss, Bill, made no attempt to conceal his disappointment. "Ethan, you've been a liability to this company for weeks now. We can't ignore the rumors about your personal life. It's affecting the business. I'm sorry, but we'll have to let you go." Ethan's knees buckled as he was escorted out. The weight of his own shame crushed him, but it didn't stop. It never did. It was over. Ethan was gone, and Grace was left to pick up the pieces. She stood in front of their bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection. The woman she saw was not the same one who had once dreamed of growing old with Ethan, of building a life together, a family. The illusion was gone, and so was the woman she used to be. She held up the framed photograph of their family, their son, their smiling faces at a beach vacation from years ago. The ache in her chest was unbearable, but it was a necessary pain. She knew she had to let go for Lucas. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the photo, a tear slipping down her cheek. The words felt empty, but they were all she had. The first few days were the hardest. Grace couldn't find the strength to do much except care for Lucas and keep up appearances. But eventually the weight began to lift, if only slightly. She leaned on Megan, who had been there from the start, never once questioning her decision. "You're not alone in this," Megan said, holding Grace's hand as they sat at her kitchen table. "We're going to make this work. You've got a future ahead of you. We'll figure it out." Grace looked at her friend, grateful for the unwavering support. She hadn't felt this supported in years. Megan helped her apply for new job opportunities, nudging her back into the workforce and offering advice on rebuilding her career. Slowly but surely, Grace began to rebuild the woman she had lost. She found solace in work, in small victories. Each step forward felt like reclaiming a part of herself she thought was gone forever. Months passed and Grace found a new rhythm. She was no longer the woman who had been blind to the cracks in her marriage. She was a mother, a professional, and a woman learning to stand on her own 2 feet again. One evening, after a successful presentation at work, Grace walked to her car, the weight of the day lifting from her shoulders. She paused, taking a deep breath. The night air felt different now, lighter, more hopeful. She had found peace, not in the shadow of her past, but in the freedom of her own choices. She smiled to herself. "I can do this." When she got home, Lucas was already asleep, his room quiet. Grace tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We're going to be okay." The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, Grace knew one thing for sure. She had control of her own narrative, and nothing was going to take that from her again. Grace sat by the window, the dim light of the evening casting long shadows across the room. Her fingers absently traced the edge of the cup in her hands, the warmth offering little comfort. Ethan's betrayal had ripped through her world, but now, months later, the scars were still raw, still alive. She thought of the lies he'd whispered to her in the quiet of the night, the promises that had once felt unbreakable. "I love you, Grace. You're everything to me." But they had all been lies. Each whispered word had been a thread weaving, a tangled web of deception. Even now, the weight of his absence was like a hollow ache in her chest. How could he have done this to me? Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, a woman who had once believed in the goodness of people, who had trusted. The truth hit her like a slap. Ethan hadn't just betrayed her. He had shattered the very foundation of who she was, and that was the hardest part to come to terms with. Grace stood in front of her closet, her fingers brushing over the clothes that once symbolized the life she had envisioned. Now each outfit felt like a costume she no longer fit into. She had spent years molding herself around Ethan, her life intertwining with his, her happiness tied to his approval. Now, in the silence of her own home, she realized how much of herself had been swallowed by that. Who am I without him? Her mind raced, filled with insecurities she had never known she harbored. Without Ethan, who was she? The woman who had once been proud of her career, her family, her life. Where had all that gone? But the question lingered. How do I find myself? Again? It was a painful journey, a path filled with self-doubt and confusion. But Grace knew, deep down, that the only way forward was to rebuild. Not for Ethan, not for anyone else, but for her. The weight of betrayal was a constant presence in Grace's mind. It crept into every corner of her thoughts, leaving nothing untouched. How could I have been so blind? But with each passing day, Grace began to realize that the pain wasn't just a consequence of Ethan's lies, it was a lesson. The trust she had given him, the blind faith, had been misplaced. And she had learned, in the hardest way possible, that trust had to be earned, not freely given. She thought of her friends, her family, the people who had stood by her, even when the walls of her world crumbled. They hadn't betrayed her. They hadn't hidden things from her. In them she found a glimmer of hope, hope that maybe not everyone in the world was capable of the cruelty Ethan had shown her. Sitting alone in the garden, Grace allowed herself a moment of reflection. The pain of losing Ethan, the life they'd built together, was still there, a quiet hum beneath the surface. But in that loss she had discovered something unexpected, a strength she hadn't known she had. The woman who had once been consumed by the need for validation the one who had been afraid to make decisions on her own, had been replaced by someone else, someone braver, more self-aware. The loss had forced her to look inward, to confront the fears and doubts that had always held her back. And in doing so, she had rediscovered herself. She smiled softly, realizing that in losing Ethan, she had found something far more valuable, her own voice. With each passing day, Grace stepped further away from the life she had once known. She embraced her newfound independence, taking steps to rebuild, to reclaim the life that had always been hers, even if she had never realized it before. She looked at the future with a sense of cautious optimism, knowing that the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had come to understand that sometimes the most painful losses could lead to the most powerful transformations. This is my time, she thought, as she walked out the door and into the future, stronger and more determined than ever. The past would always be a part of her, but it would no longer define her. Grace's journey had only just begun, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face whatever came next.